Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It was too generous, but I'll take it. I'm very so honored to be part of this meeting, and frankly so thrilled that this meeting is happening, that both the Icelandic geothermal community and many of you from around the world are all in the same place, talking about this incredibly important field that has so much to offer, that can add so much value, that is addressing one of the most fundamental challenges facing every country in the world, which is clean energy that's cost effective and can address one of the critical shortages that we're facing everywhere. I'm also honored that President Greenspan is here. I've had an opportunity to work with him and with Iceland for quite a number of years now, and I can remember very, very clearly that there was a time when this meeting couldn't have happened because the geothermal community in Iceland was present, and Iceland was a leader in the field, but the coming together into what I call a cluster, a critical mass of people working together, really hadn't yet occurred. There was a lot of people working in the field, they knew each other, but ultimately the collective was not adding power to the individual in nearly the way it could. And over the last series of years, that's changed in Iceland. And there's been an enormous development of the sophistication and the weight of this activity in Iceland, but it's also exciting to see just how much is happening elsewhere in the world, in which Icelanders are involved in the many countries in which there are geothermal resources. What I thought I'd do today is perhaps a little bit dangerous. I was here when this whole effort to develop geothermal into a real cluster, into a real coherent industry was just beginning. What I would like to do today is just in a very short amount of time talk a little bit about where we are in this field and where we need to go. And I think, I'm not a deep expert in the field, but I have worked in a lot of industries across the economy, and hopefully the perspectives that I bring will be perspectives drawn from that broad experience, and all of you that know this field much better than I will fill in the missing pieces around the directions that I'll be talking about the need to go. Now, I think that geothermal starts with just a fascinating position. And I remember I was very excited about geothermal 10 years ago, but today, given what's happening in the world, given the accelerating understanding of the importance of clean energy, given the enormous effort of huge expenditures to really develop clean energy sources, what looked great 10 years ago or even 15 years ago, we've just gone to a whole new level in the world of this opportunity that we've just been talking about. Geothermal is clean, sustainable energy. Unlike wind and solar, it operates 24/7. You don't have to deal with that problem. It has unique advantages, direct use in heating applications. It can be exported in energy-intensive products, as we've seen develop in Iceland. It creates self-reliance on the part of many communities that couldn't have self-reliance in the old world of energy. There's quite a few places in the world where there's actually geothermal resources to be developed, and many of those places really need energy. And the combination of power generation and direct use, which is quite unique to geothermal, is an enormous synergy in actually bringing down the total cost of developing this resource. In a fundamental way, geothermal should be enjoying a tremendous boom around the world. Geothermal should be on the top of everybody's mind when they talk about energy, because it has enormous, powerful advantages. It doesn't mean that geothermal is going to be all of energy, all of clean energy, but geothermal has enormous strengths. I'm sorry, wrong way. Here we go. Cost position is pretty good. Again, data is always changing. There's innovation going on in a variety of forms of renewable energy. The costs of wind and solar have been moving down quite nicely based on the data I've seen in the U.S. But geothermal is very competitive, and that's at a stage in the industry where it's still relatively small and hasn't gone through the scaling that we would see in some of these other kinds of renewable energy, and hasn't seen the opportunity to kind of cost reduce and innovate to make it better and better and cheaper. Still, despite that, geothermal is very, very competitive. You're in a place where the world desperately needs you to drive this field, to accelerate the growth and development and economic effectiveness of this technology. But yet we're sort of here, we're doing a lot, we're excited, but what do we need to do to take this to the next level? It's not that what we're doing now is bad, and it's growing. But ultimately, I think the question is, are we fully developing this fundamental opportunity to deliver something that the world needs badly, and where we have some robust advantages and expertise and experience that we can really bring to that agenda? A fascinating question for me. We have these advantages. Yes, there's some upfront risks and investment that have to be made, but that's true of all kinds of energy. To develop large-scale, solar and wind projects, we had to come up with those upfront risks as well. We had to come up with that capital. So it's not that those upfront risks are unique to us, but the question is, have we found a way to deal with that? In the way other parts of this energy field have done. And I think the question we always have to ask is, what is holding us back? And is that something we can address? Or is it some inherent weakness that means that the opportunity is actually more limited? And at least at this moment in history, I think I don't see any inherent obstacles. I think it's a question of how we proceed. So let's talk a little bit about how one sees the development of industries and products and meeting new needs across the spectrum of the economy. Let's talk a little bit about that, because I think that is going to help us understand some of the steps that need to be taken if we're going to develop this field to the whole next new level. And here I'd like to introduce some ideas that actually we introduced at the beginning of this discussion quite some years ago in Iceland. And the idea I'd like to talk about is the whole idea of a cluster. And what we see in economies around the world is where you have explosive growth and rapid innovation, that almost never happens when you have a few isolated companies. That explosive growth and rapid innovation occurs over and over again, we see, all throughout the economy, in all fields, when you can bring together a critical mass into what we call a cluster. So let's just talk a little bit about this concept of clusters. And of course, Iceland has been on the path of building a true cluster in geothermal energy. But there are other places in the world where we're starting to see this happen as well. And the question is, how could we accelerate that process? How could we achieve the critical mass that will allow us to put the trajectory of geothermal on a different line than the one it's on today, which is a line of progress and growth. I want to be clear. I understand that. But the opportunity, I think, is even bigger. Now, here's a picture of a cluster. A cluster is where you have a group of players, companies, institutions, educational organizations, trade groups, and others, all co-located in a particular geographic region. That's a cluster. And this is an example of a tourism cluster. This is a classic tourism cluster. This is in Australia. This is in the city closest to the Great Barrier Reef. So in Cairns, they have a very attractive tourist attraction, this incredible wonder of the world. But just having a tourist attraction doesn't get you to where you want to go, which is to create, first of all, a spectacular product, and also the ability to improve and drive that product quality over time. That took a cluster. And what's a cluster? Well, in the middle, in the dark blue, you see all the kind of core institutions of a tourism cluster. Hotels, places for people to stay, restaurants, attractions, places for them to go, things for them to do, including, and then airlines and cruise ships, ways of getting there. Those are kind of the core parts of a tourism cluster, okay? And then wrapped around that are other organizations and institutions that are necessary to kind of enable those core institutions to be efficient, to be effective, and to keep enhancing and improving their products and services over time. So you see, souvenirs. So when a tourist visits someplace, they like to be able to buy a souvenir. Well, if you have a well-developed souvenir business wrapped around the cluster, that allows the cluster to do better, to capture higher revenue, to provide a better customer experience. You need local transportation. You don't need to get there, to that location. You got to move around. So you need kind of taxis and other local transportation mechanisms. On the input side, you need food suppliers that are supporting the food service industry in that area. You see the others. You need entities, government entities, institutions, to kind of set rules of the game, to inspect quality, to set standards, to train the people necessary, and to organize the collaboration among the actors in the industry. Why do you need this cluster to actually deliver world-class products and grow those products over time? You need them because all of these entities are mutually dependent. If any part of the cluster isn't present, that erodes the competitive position of everything else. Let's take an example. Suppose you're running a hotel in this city in Australia. And suppose, let's just say, stipulate that you're running the best hotel in the world. You're doing everything right. You have the best rooms, the best service, the best amenities, everything you're doing right in that hotel. Does that mean your hotel's going to be successful? You're doing everything right. And the answer, of course, is no. Because if your guest who comes to the hotel for a wonderful experience in your country goes to the beach, and the beach is covered with trash, and there's security problems, so they're afraid of getting kind of robbed, And when they come into the airport, they have to stand in line in customs for 1 hour and 30 minutes to get their passport stamped. If those other things go wrong, that nullifies how great your hotel is. And your hotel is probably not going to have a great future if you don't have the success around you. We want a lot of great tourist attractions. We want terrific selection of restaurants. We want very efficient logistics of getting people to us and getting them home. We want all those local services to be really well. And if we can put all that together, everybody benefits. Everybody gets more competitive. Everybody has a better product. Everybody can operate more efficiently. That's the cluster concept. Now here's another cluster, which is a little closer to what you all do, which is oil and gas in Houston. And this cluster, again, has all the same elements. You look at all their exploration and development companies, their completion and production companies, their various downstream entities, and then there's this huge oil field services and engineering and contracting industry in which we've got firms that are really specialized in delivering all the key services and managing the development of oil and gas resources. And there's a lot of other specialized institutions around that in terms of training and engineering departments and industry associations, and all these other entities are wrapped around them in Houston. Now, we've had a little bit of revival lately in the United States, but Houston and that area, over time exported less and less oil and gas. But the power and impact for value creation and for oil and gas around the world exploded. And that's because this cluster wasn't just about raw materials, it was about technology. It was about knowledge. It was about packaging services together and enabling this field on a global basis. It wasn't just a local thing about developing the resource in America. It became a global juggernaut. That's what a cluster can do. When you get the critical mass, when you can put all these pieces together, your opportunity, your scope, your impact only grow. And we see that in industries around the world. The industries where things take off are ones where you can create this critical mass and where people start truly both competing and collaborating to drive faster progress and development of whatever the product or service is that you offer. And we see this in developing countries as well. This is just an example of a very different kind of cluster. Flowers, cut flowers in Kenya, which is, I think, their single largest export now. It was zero 20 years ago, but when they put together the critical mass of the growers and the farmers and the post-harvest and all those pieces you see on this screen, then it took off. And this became a truly global export hub for this very large industry, cut fresh flowers. When a cluster starts to gel and create critical mass, it has to build the right business environment. We've got to make sure that we have the right inputs in terms of talent, in terms of technology, in terms of scientific expertise in that particular field, in terms of capital availability that enables that field to grow and invest. We need a strong base of local companies that are kind of fighting it out and competing to see who's better. And move faster. We need sophisticated local needs. We find that most of the world-class clusters that exist, whether it's automotive in Japan or microelectronics in California, the strong clusters often start with very sophisticated local demand. And because they can serve their local needs and they learn how to do that well, that allows them to be competitive in serving international needs. And then, of course, you need that mix of related and supporting industries, the supplier bases, the supporting institutions that exist in all those pictures. And one needs to build that critical mass. And then once one builds that critical mass, competitiveness rises, and generally industry growth explodes. And that is something we see over and over and over again. You know, clusters allow companies then to be more productive, to operate more efficiently, to innovate faster, to commercialize rapidly, and then export across borders, because they get so good and they're so competitive that they're the place to go for this particular product or this particular service or this particular technology. That's the whole cluster concept. So that says that if you're trying to develop a field in a country like Iceland, you don't want to have a bunch of separate companies. You actually want to build a true cluster that sees itself as this codependent group of actors, that if they can appropriately collaborate while competing, this will propel the entire competitiveness of the entire field in that area rapidly forward. Iceland has built a cluster here that we'll talk a little bit about in geothermal. We'll talk about that in a minute. I think the ability to put that together is now giving this industry an opportunity to step up its pace of growth. Iceland is now starting to do this sort of activity in tourism, which is a rapidly growing field, and also we see seeds of this in other parts of the economy. This is the cluster concept. This is now, I think, the playbook for how you ignite growth and competitiveness in a particular field, in a particular location. And the question is, and it becomes a way of organizing your public policy and making choices about, how to promote exports and how to train the workforce. All of that can be wrapped around this concept. So I think what that tells us is that as we think about how to put the geothermal field onto a different path, if we're going to be truly, truly successful, we have to build this structure. And we have to kind of change the mindset of how the various actors in the field are working together if we're going to enjoy this opportunity to accelerate competitiveness and accelerate growth. Now, of course, Iceland in this field of geothermal is far from the only country, but it's become a major player in geothermal. And I think what's very distinctive about Iceland is the very high penetration of geothermal in terms of the overall energy mix in this country. And that's created some interesting opportunities, I think, that we'll talk about in a minute. But let's look at the Iceland case through this lens and kind of see where we've come so far in Iceland. And then I'd like to talk about, what if we wanted to go further in Iceland? What would we do? Given everything we know about economic development and cluster development in other fields. And then for all of you here that are not from Iceland, what do we need to do globally to put this field on a different trajectory? What can you be doing back in your home countries to unlock and unleash much more progress in this field? So let's talk a little bit about that. So I think Iceland is a significant global player already. This is just a chart about the fact that Icelandic geothermal companies are out there in the world, engaged in a lot of projects in a variety of different ways. So this field is not just local, it's now international. And that was very much part of the hope that would come out of this and part of the game plan. And this is not new, this has been going on for some time, but I think it's been accelerating over the recent years. Iceland has a cluster in geothermal. In this country, there's quite a co-location of a lot of the key assets in the cluster. And you can see the picture both on the power side and also on the direct heating side. There's quite a bit of infrastructure in place around the market, around the resource, around permitting, around licensing. There's some related clusters in this economy that have taken advantage of this resource to enhance their competitiveness, and you see some of those. So we have here in Iceland the critical mass in this field, and many of you here are part of that. It's that critical mass that in many ways is most important, not any individual entity. And it's the ability of the individual entities to collaborate where they benefit from collaboration that is the most important asset in a sense of being here. We see over time how this effort and over long history has built up enormous skills, which were just spoken about in the video and in the previous session, previous speaker. There's a lot of research going on here in this field because this field has attracted the attention of a lot of researchers who are focusing their efforts on this field. There's a lot of curriculum and courses in this field which are raising the bar in terms of human resources. This is the classic cluster effect, where you put together a critical mass, this other stuff starts to happen. And you want to encourage that and support it vigorously if you're going to want to raise your competitiveness. There's a very interesting mix of demand applications in Iceland, obviously on the electricity side, which is not only electricity, but it's also electricity that's involved in other industries that use electricity. So we have these green data centers. We have a whole mix of applications. It's not just electric power generation that goes onto the grid. Obviously, the space heating is well known. That's where it all started here at a large scale. But what's happening is there's a growing array of other direct utilization applications that are popping up, and you see a few of those in the upper left. So that's a very interesting array of demand here in Iceland. And what we find is the more sophisticated and the more focused and segmented your demand is at home, that often equips you to compete even more effectively abroad because you understand more needs and you can package your products and services to actually meet those specific needs better than a location where there's really only one use that anybody has actually tried to fulfill. There's a great critical mass of companies here. Many of you are in the room, both Icelandic companies, but also companies in this field from around the world have kind of come here. The most competitive locations in the world don't have just local companies. They have a panoply of the companies that matter globally. And the more you can get, the best in the world coming together, the more you reignite and strengthen the competitiveness and the innovation that goes on. And so it's not a threat, it's an opportunity. Many developing countries sort of put their hands up and say, no, we don't want the foreign companies. We want to hold this field for the local companies. But what we've learned 100 times is that doesn't work very well. You need smart, advanced companies coming in, and that helps grow everybody's capability and pushes everybody to get better and improve and become more global. So we've got that going for us. This geothermal cluster initiative here has grown up to my great excitement. We now have a vehicle for this cluster to be a cluster, for the actors to have a systematic way of getting together, to start to look for these opportunities for relationships and scaling and building out the infrastructure and the other missing links in driving this area forward. There's been an agenda here in Iceland around the cluster, which is still relatively early days, and it will continue. And the more we can have a strategy, not about individual companies, but a strategy about how we're going to make Iceland a better place for geothermal development, technology, products, services. The more we can kind of have a high-level vision for how Iceland's going to build this up over time, the more competitive we'll be, the more efficient we'll be. And there are many examples of that from around the world. So all this is good. The activities of the cluster initiative are getting more numerous. And this is just a list of some of the things that have happened relatively recently. We have a small business incubator. We have a lot of things taking root here that I think are just going to feed on themselves. So I think this cluster here in Iceland is on a pretty good path. And we're poised. But as your friend, I will tell you that we have a ways to go, from my opinion, as an outside observer who's worked with clusters around the world. Number one, I think the industry's pretty organized, but the ability for government and the major research organizations in this country to truly get engaged in this effort, I think, is still early days. And I think the government's played a tremendous amount of positive benefit for developing the cluster here. I think President Grimson is the chief marketing officer, for the cluster in Iceland, and he's like awesome. That said, from a public policy standpoint, from a systematic, policy within government to do everything government needs to do to make this, get more sophisticated and easier and simpler, I think we have a ways to go. There's a lot of research going on, but I think we can better connect the research to the actual needs of the companies, and so we need to bridge that gap a little bit better here. We have been doing research, but we're not focused on IP. We're not patenting. We're developing all this intellectual capital, but we haven't patented it and created intellectual property, and that's a sign that we're giving up opportunity. We're not thinking the right way about what we're doing, which is creating fundamentally powerful intellectual capital. Yes, we're creating some projects, but what we're really creating that's really, really big is the IP. It's the methods, it's the science, it's the products, the pieces of the puzzle that are required to do geothermal. And I think there's an opportunity to step up our whole view of the fact that intellectual property is a big part of what we're doing here in Iceland. And it's happening, but we're just not capturing it. And that is, I think, a critical part of any truly successful, research cluster is that focus on IP. I think companies here are working together a little bit, but there can be a lot more collaboration, company to company. We've got relatively small companies in many cases, but they're still working alone. We're a little fragmented still. There's lots of individual efforts, lots of individual service providers going to this country or that country to provide this service or that service, but what we're not seeing is the kind of packaging of solutions that we are selling, and we are helping other countries with this problem through delivering those solutions, end-to-end solutions. Right now, it's every project is a little different, every service is a little different, every client's a little different. One of the things we see that we need to develop in clusters like this that are going to really take off is we got to have solutions. And the companies involved in making that total solution have to learn how to work collaboratively very, very much together. We could go much more rapidly in internationalization again if this was a more collaborative activity. Where multiple companies would take these things on together as opposed to having individual companies do it. We have a lot of projects in Iceland that are very innovative. Remember that earlier slide about the various applications of the direct the direct geothermal in a variety of different areas. Well, each of those demands is a product. So let me see if I can find that slide just to remember a couple of them and highlight them for you. The slide talked about fish drying and farming. So do we have a geothermal, fish drying and farming package? And we could go around to all the other places that are major players in the fishing industry and say, okay, here's our package, here's our product. And it's a complete product, and we'll help you put it into place and get it up and running. And by the way, here's why you should trust us, because we do it at home successfully, okay? That's, I think, an opportunity that we could go even further. How do we improve the ease of financing and create financing structures and mechanisms like now exist in wind and solar? There's all kinds of financing structures out there, and they require upfront cost, and they have an ROI, and you don't get your money out, the first day. So how do we package our financing in a way that it isn't so complicated? How do we move that ball in the direction of something that we can scale rather than do on a one-off basis? How do we get to know the international development banks and start working aggressively with them to build these financing mechanisms for various types of projects off the shelf, so that we can just go and say, here's the kind of project we want to do, and they say, oh, okay, that's great. Here's how we can get that done quickly, rather than everything being really, really complicated. And finally, I think somehow we need to kind of take President Grimson and we need to multiply him by 1 million. Because we don't have a marketing plan. Geothermal isn't getting mind share like all this other stuff. Everybody in the world knows about solar. Everybody in the world knows about wind. Everybody in the world, that's top of mind. Even though it's not that competitive in many cases, even though we offer a better solution in many cases. Even though geothermal is more practical in many cases. We need a marketing plan. We need to raise the visibility of this entire field, and it might seem like too much of a burden for Iceland to have to do that. It's a small country. But ultimately, I think, if this field is going to take off, it can't be a kind of word-of-mouth thing. It can't be a one-off type thing. It's got to be something where we kind of have to capture greater visibility and mind share. And I think this is even more important when we think globally. I think all the people in this room, from all the countries you're in that are in this field, we need to figure out a way to raise the visibility of this entire field in a way that we deserve, given the reality of what we do, what our product is, and just how powerful it is. But ultimately, we haven't gotten the message across. And, President Grimson can only go to so many places and talk about this so many times. And we need to find some more mass marketing and social media. I don't know what it is, but we need a marketing plan. Now, the same issues apply globally in this field. And a lot of you are from other countries that are participating in geothermal. And I would probably guess that most of you are in a similar situation. And in many cases, Iceland may be well ahead, having started this process of organizing the cluster and trying to build that collaborative approach. How do we go forward globally here? And once again, I would start with the first order is how to get more visibility to this whole field. And Iceland can only do so much, but what if all the people in this room and all the countries you were from and all the other companies and businesses and governments that you are connected to, what if we together in some collaborative way started, again, raising the visibility of our field? Because if people don't know, if particularly in a world where governments have to be sort of involved, it's going to limit our opportunities. So we have to build that visibility. Look at this. Total support provided by the 28 member EU states. Where are we? 0. And that's not because there isn't potential, and there's not because of what we do isn't good. And Europe may not be our biggest opportunity in this field, but the point is that we're not visible. We somehow haven't penetrated, despite the fact that everybody in the world is talking about clean energy now. So I think the moment now to kind of sort of reposition ourselves in this field is very, 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 very timely. Financing. Financing is not only an issue for Icelandic companies in this field abroad, it's an issue for all of you. I've tried in a couple of countries to kind of get geothermal going, and you just get worn down because there's no package, there's no solution where you can just say, oh, we've got this kind of project, here's the financing structure for that. And the bank is, teed up to deliver that. Yes, every project's a little different, but that's true in all kinds of energy. So financing structures and sort of bringing other institutions, financing institutions into this game besides the small number that are in there today, I think is going to be a real challenge for us globally. How do we raise the visibility and the opportunity to grow direct utilization of this technology? It's one of the things that are very intriguing and differentiating about geothermal, and yet this is really not, in a sense, on people's radar screen. How many industries understand how powerful this could be as a cost-reducing mechanism for them if they could tie a geothermal project to both direct and power applications. It's a great story that even I, who've been following this industry for a long time, really didn't get this story until recently, until I saw some of the new projects that were happening here in Iceland. And you all know the data on how powerful direct utilization can be on the economics. There are some great examples. Here's a story about Indonesia. And this government somehow got it. There was a direct utilization component here to this electrical generation project, and it worked. And so here's a model. Can we package up this model? Can we start to create these applications that we can then go and market around the world and within our own country? I think so. There's a tremendous need. This is a game changer. How do we get that done? Industry standards. Here's an industry that, again, compared to most of the industries in which I work, the industry standardization effort is very nascent. There's just not enough standards that cover enough things, and therefore we have the fragmentation. Therefore, we raise the costs. Therefore, we don't see rapid innovation because there's too many different ways to do it, rather than really driving down the cost and improving the value of a particular standard method. We see in industry after industry, if you can't achieve standardization, it's kind of like tying your legs together and not being able to run. It slows you down. So how would we get international standards to take place in this industry? How could we move that needle? There's lots of experience in other industries about how to do that, and we can as well. And then finally, I would just say that the whole issue of cluster development, country by country, region by region, is a real opportunity. How can we build a cluster of clusters? Where in Kenya and Southeast Asia and other parts of the world that have substantial geothermal resources, we start seeing these critical masses grow up, and then they start to collaborate. And, a wonderful example of that is in the flower business. The Dutch are by far the world leaders in flowers. Not just bulbs, but in cut flowers. And a lot of the cut flowers in this world, a good market share, actually are shipped from Holland in airplanes every day. Now, the Dutch realized that they didn't necessarily have the best resource at home for flower cultivation. Now, of course, they did it in greenhouses. They could control the environment. They put enormous technology into the process of growing flowers. They were able to do it closed loop without even putting the flowers in the soil, putting them on platforms. There's a tremendous technological innovation in Holland to try to dramatically improve the efficiency and reduce the environmental impact of flower growing in that country. But they realized at some point that they were not going to be able to efficiently supply fresh cut flowers on a global basis from Holland. After all, the weather's pretty lousy, it's cold, it's just not the place where you have this natural resource that you would expect to need. So what did the Dutch do? The Dutch created the flower cluster in Kenya that I showed you earlier. It was Dutch entrepreneurs that went out and put in place the foundation of growers and greenhouses and so forth that enabled Kenya to start to build their cluster. And the Dutch invested there, and they were part of that. And they not only brought technology, but they also started participating in all the dimensions of the flower cluster. And then the Dutch did something else. They went to Ecuador, and they built a flower cluster in Ecuador. And they built flower clusters elsewhere. Now, I don't want to put the total burden on Iceland. But the point is, if we want this field to really develop, we're going to have to do everything we can to get in each of the areas of the world where there's major resource. We're going to need to put in place this process that starts to build the critical mass, that starts to assemble the expertise, that starts to put together the companies that can develop that resource and develop it and improve their efficiency and be better and better at it and implement the new applications. And it starts to become a self-reinforcing system. And I think that I hope my friends in Iceland will see that as a long-term aspiration. But I also hope that all of you from elsewhere in the world that are here will see the power of this philosophy towards building this area of geothermal. I think we have an obligation, all of you have an obligation to figure out how to deploy this enormously important and powerful resource and set of technologies at this time in human history where we badly need to move faster. And I'm very, very confident that this is such an opportunity and there's such a competitive advantage here that this is possible. But that will take us to sort of think more boldly about our field. Tackle some of these big complicated issues like standards and financing in a more unified way rather than incrementally, project by project, location by location. It will get us all thinking much more about collaboration rather than our little piece. Because ultimately it's the our little piece mindset that is one of the biggest constraints to the development of this field. And so this may be a radical idea to many of you, but I'm very, very confident that given the moment in history, given the acceptance of the need for an epic energy transformation that is happening and will happen now and over the next 10 or 20 years, this is our moment. And if we got to step up our game because we don't want to be locked out because others move more aggressively in their fields. So thank you all for your attention today. I'm just thrilled that this group is together. I couldn't resist the opportunity with all of you together to kind of raise some of these issues, which I hope all of you will feel energized by, and you won't think I'm too crazy. So thank you very much, and we'll look forward to the discussion.